Everyone knows the Boss 429. Everyone thinks they know the Boss 429. It's one of the most celebrated, most photographed, most worshipped muscle cars ever to roll off an American assembly line. But here's the thing about legends. The more people talk about them, the more the real story gets buried underneath the myth. And the real story of the 1970 Ford Mustang Boss 429 is wilder, stranger, and more fascinating than anything you've read on a spec sheet. Secret number 1. The engine that wasn't supposed to be there. And the beginning of the Boss 429 story isn't a design studio. It isn't a test track. It's a rulebook. Specifically, NASCAR's rulebook. And the fact that this car exists at all is basically the result of Ford finding a loophole and then driving a 500 horsepower engine straight through it. By the late 1960s, the horsepower wars between Ford and Chrysler had moved off the street and onto the high banks of Daytona and Talladega. Chrysler had the 426 Hemi, and that engine was absolutely destroying everything Ford brought to the party. On the super speedways, where top speed was everything, the Hemi's hemispherical combustion chambers gave it a breathing advantage that Ford's existing engines simply couldn't match. Ford needed an answer, a real answer, not a bigger carburetor or a hotter camshaft, a completely new engine. So Ford's engineers went to work on the 429 cubic inch semi-Hemi V8. They called the combustion chamber design a crescent shape rather than a true hemisphere, which is either brilliant engineering nuance or the world's most convenient technicality, depending on how generous you're feeling. Either way, the result was an engine with enormous valves, exceptional airflow, and the kind of top-end power that could compete with Chrysler on the big tracks. But here's where NASCAR's rulebook enters the picture. To run any engine in NASCAR's premier division, manufacturers had to homologate it. That meant installing that engine in a certain number of street-legal production cars available to the general public. You couldn't just bolt a race motor into a stock car and go racing. You had to prove the engine existed in the real world, on real roads, where real people could theoretically buy one and drive it to the grocery store. Ford needed to homologate the 429, and they needed a car to put it in. The Mustang was America's most recognizable performance car. The choice seemed obvious. Except, there was one significant problem. The 429 cubic inch engine was enormous, massive, cartoonishly large for the Mustang's engine bay. Fitting it into the car would require surgery so extensive it bordered on automotive violence. Ford looked at the challenge, looked at what was at stake against Chrysler, and decided to perform the surgery anyway. That decision created the Boss 429, a car that was never really designed as a road car at all. It was designed as a rulebook compliance vehicle that happened to come with a steering wheel and a radio. The fact that it became one of the greatest muscle cars in history was almost an accident, and honestly, that makes it even better. Secret number 2, the Kar Kraft connection. Here's something the glossy magazine features almost always skip over. Ford did not build the Boss 429 in a Ford factory. They couldn't. The modifications required to shoehorn that 429 engine into the Mustang's engine bay were so extensive, so radical, and so far outside the normal assembly line process that Ford's own plants weren't equipped to handle it. Enter Kar Kraft, a specialty contractor based in Brighton, Michigan, that Ford had been working with on various projects throughout the 1960s. Kar Kraft was essentially Ford's secret weapon for jobs that required more creativity than a standard production line could offer. And the Boss 429 was exactly that kind of job. Here's what the process actually looked like. Ford would build standard Mustang sports roof fastbacks at their Dearborn assembly plant, essentially rolling them off the line as normal cars. Then those cars would be shipped to the Kar Kraft facility before they were completed. And at Kar Kraft, everything changed. The front shock towers on a standard Mustang were simply too close together to accommodate the 429's massive block. So Kar Kraft's team cut them out, completely removed them. Then they fabricated and welded and repositioned shock towers that were moved outward by approximately 1 inch on each side. This wasn't a tweak. This wasn't an adjustment. This was structural surgery on a car that had already been partially assembled. They were essentially rebuilding the front end of the Mustang from the firewall forward. Then came the engine installation. The battery had to be relocated to the trunk to create clearance. The engine sat so deep in the chassis that accessing certain components required a level of patience and creative thinking that most mechanics of the era simply didn't have. After the engine was in and everything was buttoned up, the cars were shipped back to Ford for final finishing and delivery. Every single Boss 429 built in 1969 and 1970 went through this process. Everyone. Which means every Boss 429 is essentially a hand-built car. Not in the romantic European sports car sense, but in the very literal sense that a team of workers at a contractor facility physically restructured each one by hand. For a car that competed in the muscle car market on price, that's remarkable, and almost nobody talks about it. Kar Kraft eventually closed its doors in 1971, a casualty of the same forces that killed the muscle car era, but their work lives on in every Boss 429 that survives today. Next time you see one at a car show, you're not just looking at a Ford, you're looking at a Kar Kraft. Secret number 3, the horsepower. Lie? Ford said the Boss 429 made 375 horsepower. Ford was not telling the truth, and Ford knew they weren't telling the truth, and everyone in the industry knew they weren't telling the truth. And yet, the number appeared in brochures, on specification sheets, and in dealer showrooms across America with a completely straight face. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated strategy with a very specific target audience in mind, not buyers, insurance companies. By the late 1960s, the insurance industry had woken up to what the muscle car wars actually meant for their actuarial tables. Young men were buying 450 horsepower machines with the driving experience of someone who'd been behind the wheel for 3 years, and the results were showing up in claims departments everywhere. Insurance companies started rating vehicles based on published horsepower figures. Higher numbers meant higher premiums. High enough premiums could kill a car's sales before it ever found an audience. So manufacturers played the game. Chrysler did it with the Hemi, General Motors did it with the LS6, and Ford did it with the Boss 429. The published figure of 375 horsepower was conservative to the point of being almost comedic to anyone who had actually driven the car. Independent dyno testing by automotive journalists at the time told a different story. Road Test Magazine, Car and Driver, Motor Trend. They all recorded numbers that suggested the real output was significantly higher. Conservative estimates placed actual output closer to 450 horsepower at the crankshaft. Less conservative estimates, from people who had spent more time actually running these engines on the strip, pushed the number past 500. The Boss 429's engine featured an aluminum cylinder head design with enormous intake and exhaust valves. The intake valves measured 2.28 inches in diameter. To put that in perspective, that's approaching the size of a tennis ball. The exhaust ports were equally impressive, and the result was an engine that could move air at high RPM in ways that the published horsepower figure simply didn't reflect. Ford wasn't lying to protect buyers. They were lying to protect sales. And it worked. The Boss 429 slipped past insurance underwriters with numbers that looked aggressive but not outrageous, while delivering performance that embarrassed exotic sports cars at stoplights across America. It was one of the great con jobs in automotive history, and it was completely legal, somewhat admirable really, in a morally flexible kind of way. Secret number 4, the suspension overhaul. Nobody asked for, remember those repositioned shock towers from the Kar Kraft story? Here's the part that nobody anticipated. Moving those shock towers outward to make room for the engine didn't just solve a packaging problem. It accidentally, almost incidentally, made the Boss 429 handle better than any Mustang that had come before it. Standard Mustangs of the era had a reputation for straight-line performance and, let's be diplomatic here, spirited handling characteristics, which is another way of saying that pushing one hard into a corner was an activity that required genuine bravery and possibly a helmet. The front suspension geometry of the standard 1970 Mustang was compromised by the narrow shock tower placement, limiting the amount of suspension travel and creating handling dynamics that rewarded cautious driving rather than enthusiasm. The Boss 429's repositioned shock towers created a wider front track, not dramatically wider, but measurably wider. And that change, combined with the addition of a front anti-roll bar that was thicker than anything fitted to a standard Mustang, produced a car with noticeably better cornering behavior. The front end sat flatter in corners, Weight transfer was more controlled. The steering, while still heavy by modern standards, had better feedback through the wheel. Ford also fitted the Boss 429 with staggered rear shock absorbers. One shock was mounted in front of the rear axle and one behind it, a setup borrowed directly from racing applications that reduced the tendency for the rear axle to hop during hard acceleration. This wasn't a standard feature on Mustangs. It was an addition specific to the Boss 429, and it made a real difference on the drag strip and on the street. The result was a Mustang that could actually be driven hard in the real world, not in the European sports car sense. This was still a big, heavy American muscle car with a massive engine in the nose. But compared to what Mustang buyers were used to, the Boss 429 felt almost sophisticated. Engineers who set out to solve an engine packaging problem accidentally created the best handling Mustang of the era. That's the kind of happy accident that automotive history is made of. Secret number 5, the Boss 429 was nearly canceled before it launched. This one is uncomfortable for anyone who loves this car, because the Boss 429 came within a very short distance of never existing at all. And the threat didn't come from engineers or regulators. It came from inside Ford's own boardroom. By 1968, when the Boss 429 program was being developed, Ford was already beginning to feel the financial pressure that would reshape the entire American automotive industry over the following decade. The investment required to homologate the 429 engine was substantial. The Kar Kraft arrangement added cost to every single car. The repositioned shock towers required retooling. The hand assembly process was slow and expensive compared to standard line production. Ford's bean counters ran the numbers, and the numbers were not encouraging. The Boss 429 was going to cost significantly more to produce than it could realistically be sold for, while remaining competitive in the market. Every car built would essentially be sold at a loss or at margins thin enough to make financial executives deeply uncomfortable. And there was a serious internal argument about whether NASCAR homologation was worth that investment. The people who saved the Boss 429 were Ford's performance division engineers and executives who understood what was at stake competitively. The argument they made was simple but powerful. Losing to the Hemi on the superspeedways wasn't just a racing problem. It was a marketing problem. It was a credibility problem. Ford's performance reputation, which drove sales across the entire lineup, depended on being seen as competitive with Chrysler at the highest level. The cost of the Boss 429 program had to be weighed against the cost of surrendering that reputation. The argument worked. The program survived, but it survived by a margin that would probably alarm enthusiasts if they knew exactly how close the vote was. The Boss 429 entered production for 1969 by what amounts to a corporate near miss. And every time you see one of these cars, you're looking at a machine that almost never made it out of a conference room. Secret number 6. The color nobody wanted that everyone wants now. Ford offered the Boss 429 in some of the most spectacular colors of the muscle car era. Grabber blue, grabber orange, calypso coral, pastel blue. These weren't subtle shades. These were colors that announced your presence from 3 blocks away and made absolutely no apology for it. And in 1970, a significant number of buyers walked right past them and ordered their Boss 429 in black or white. It seems almost incomprehensible today, but context matters. In 1970, bright colors on muscle cars were still a relatively new phenomenon. The grabber shades were new additions to the Ford palette that year, and not everyone was ready to drive something that looked like it had been painted by someone who'd confused a car with a traffic cone. Plenty of buyers, particularly older buyers or buyers in more conservative markets, specifically requested the darker, more traditional colors. Some dealers reported sitting on grabber blue and calypso coral examples for months while black and white cars moved immediately. Fast forward to today, and the market has completely reversed. Grabber Blue Boss 429 examples carry significant premiums over the same car in conventional colors. Calypso Coral, which was actually a fairly rare color even when new because so few people ordered it, has become one of the most sought-after Boss 429 configurations in existence. A well-documented numbers-matching Boss 429 in one of the bright grabber shades, in excellent condition, can command prices that would have seemed like science fiction to the dealer who couldn't sell it in 1970. There's a lesson in there somewhere about trusting your instincts and buying the loud color. The people who walked past the grabber blue car to get the sensible black one missed out on two things simultaneously: the experience of driving the most visually spectacular version of a legendary machine, and an investment return that most financial instruments would struggle to match. Life is short. Buy the blue car. Secret number 7. The racing career that never happened. Here's the great irony at the heart of the Boss 429 story. This car was built to go NASCAR racing. It was literally created for that specific purpose. And then it didn't really go NASCAR racing, at least not in the way anyone planned. The homologation requirement was met. The 429 engine was installed in enough street cars to satisfy the rulebook. Ford's racing teams prepared their stock cars with the 429 engine and took them to the superspeedways. And then, 1970 happened. Ford, in one of the more stunning corporate decisions of the muscle car era, announced they were withdrawing from factory-sponsored NASCAR competition. Budget concerns, shifting corporate priorities, the changing political and cultural climate around racing. Ford walked away from the series that the Boss 429 had been specifically engineered to conquer. The 429 engine did see racing success. In drag racing, where the engine's massive torque and strong bottom end made it a genuine threat in the right hands. Modified versions of the Boss 429 showed up in various NHRA classes and acquitted themselves well. But the superspeedway dominance that the entire car had been engineered to achieve never materialized the way Ford's engineers had envisioned. What makes this particularly fascinating is what the car became instead. Without a factory racing program to define its identity, the Boss 429 became something arguably more interesting. It became a street legend. It became the car that serious enthusiasts bought because they understood what was under the hood, even when the general public didn't fully grasp it. The Boss 429 earned its reputation the hard way through actual performance in the hands of real drivers on real roads, rather than through a curated factory racing narrative. That reputation turned out to be worth more in the long run than any number of NASCAR victories. Secret number 8. The Boss 529 versus the Hemi, the street war Ford, started. Let's talk about what was really going on here. Because the Boss 429 wasn't just a performance car, it was a declaration of war, a specifically targeted, carefully engineered response to one engine from one manufacturer. And that engine was the Chrysler 426 cubic inch Hemi. The Hemi had been dominating American performance culture since its reintroduction in 1964. It was in the Plymouth Roadrunner, it was in the Dodge Charger, it was in the Cuda. It was winning drag races, winning NASCAR events, and winning the marketing war that mattered almost as much as the actual races. The Hemi had become shorthand for ultimate American performance, and Ford could not allow that to stand unchallenged. The Boss 429 was Ford's answer. And the comparison between the two engines is genuinely interesting because they took different philosophical approaches to making power. The Hemi was a torque monster. Low-end, brutal, and violent. It made massive power from the moment you touched the throttle and pulled hard all the way through the rev range. The Boss 429 was a different animal. Its strength was at higher RPM. The enormous valves and exceptional breathing characteristics meant the engine came alive in ways that surprised people who expected it to behave like a conventional big block. Head-to-head testing between the two cars was conducted by automotive publications throughout 1969 and 1970. And the results were close enough to keep the argument alive for decades. On the drag strip, a well-tuned Hemi Cuda or Hemi Roadrunner could beat a stock Boss 429. But the Boss 429's engine responded exceptionally well to modifications, and a tuned example could reverse that result. On road courses, the Boss 429's superior chassis gave it an advantage the Hemi cars couldn't match. On the street, where conditions were never perfect and drivers were never professional, the results depended more on who was driving than what was under the hood. Ford never definitively won the war they started, but they made it close enough that nobody could claim the Hemi was untouchable anymore. And in the muscle car era, forcing a stalemate against the Hemi was its own kind of victory. Secret number 9. The rarest Boss 429. You've never heard of. Everybody knows about the standard Boss 429. 1969 production, 1970 production, Kar Kraft built, factory colors, the whole story. But there are variants and one-off examples floating around the edges of Boss 429 history that the mainstream conversation almost never reaches. During development, Ford and Kar Kraft produced a small number of prototype and pre-production cars that were used for engineering evaluation, press preview events, and internal testing. Some of these cars were built to specifications that differed from production versions. Different suspension tuning, different engine calibrations, different interior configurations. A handful of these prototype cars survived the process without being destroyed, which was the typical fate of pre-production vehicles. Their current whereabouts are, in several cases, genuinely unknown, which is either intriguing or heartbreaking depending on your perspective. Then there's the matter of factory drag racing variants. While Ford's official factory racing program ended before it fully developed, there were Boss 429 engines prepared to much higher specifications for drag racing use. Some of these engines found their way into cars through semi-official channels. Not quite factory race cars, not quite standard production cars, something in between. Cars that exist in the historical record as production Boss 429 examples, but contain components that never appeared in any production specification. There were also documented cases of dealers working with Kar Kraft or independent shops to create Boss 429 cars and body styles other than the sports roof fastback. Convertible Boss 429 cars were built in very small numbers. These weren't factory conversions. They were dealer or specialty shop builds using genuine Boss 429 drivetrains. Their legitimacy as Boss 429 cars is debated by purists, but their existence is documented, and a convertible Boss 429, regardless of how you classify it, is an extraordinary object. The Boss 429 world has edges that enthusiasts spend entire careers exploring. Every few years, a car emerges from a barn or an estate sale with documentation that raises new questions about what Ford and Kar Kraft actually built during those 2 production years. It's a history that hasn't been fully written yet. Secret number 10. Why the Boss 429 died after just 2 years. 1971. That's all it took. 1 model year. The Boss 429 existed in 1969. It continued in 1970, and then in 1971, it was gone. No farewell tour, no special final edition, no acknowledgement of what was being lost. Just gone. The forces that killed the Boss 429 didn't arrive suddenly. They had been building throughout the late 1960s, gathering momentum like a slow-moving storm that everyone could see coming, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. 3 separate pressures converged simultaneously in 1971. And together they made the Boss 429 impossible to continue. The first was emissions regulations. The Environmental Protection Agency had been created in December of 1970, and new emission standards were coming that would require fundamental changes to how high-performance engines were calibrated. High compression ratios, which were essential to the Boss 429's power output, were incompatible with the low lead and unleaded fuels that regulations were pushing the industry toward. The 429's compression ratio of 10.5 to 1 would have required significant detuning to survive in the new regulatory environment. The engine that emerged from that detuning wouldn't have been the Boss 429 anymore. It would have been something wearing the Boss 429's name and producing a fraction of its performance. The second was the insurance industry. By 1971, insurance premiums on high-performance cars had reached levels that were genuinely pricing younger buyers, the core muscle car audience, out of the market. Manufacturers were increasingly reluctant to publish performance specifications that would trigger the highest insurance classifications. The entire muscle car market was contracting under this pressure. The third was Ford's own changing priorities. The company had withdrawn from NASCAR. The competitive rationale for maintaining the Boss 429 program had evaporated. Without racing to justify the expense, and without a market that could sustain the cost structure that the Kar Kraft arrangement required, the program simply couldn't be defended internally. So, Ford killed it, quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. The last Boss 429 rolled through the Kar Kraft facility in the spring of 1970. And then Kar Kraft kept going for a while, finding other work, until the market for that kind of work dried up too, and they closed in 1971. The whole ecosystem that created the Boss 429 collapsed within about 18 months of the car's discontinuation. What Ford didn't know, and couldn't have known, was that those 2 production years would generate a legacy that has only grown more valuable with time. The Boss 429 became more famous after it was gone than it ever was while it was being built. Today, a numbers-matching Boss 429 in documented original condition represents one of the most significant investments in the entire muscle car collector market. Examples in the grabber colors with low mileage and full provenance documentation have sold for figures that approach and sometimes exceed $300,000. That price reflects something beyond rarity and performance history. It reflects the fact that the Boss 429 represents a specific moment in American automotive history that can never be repeated. The moment when manufacturers were building engines without asking whether they should. When horsepower was pursued as an end in itself, without apology and without restraint. When the answer to every engineering challenge was more, bigger, faster, and the rulebook was something you navigated around rather than complied with. The 1970 Ford Mustang Boss 429 was a car built to satisfy a racing rulebook, hand-assembled in a contractor's facility, powered by an engine whose real output Ford deliberately concealed in colors that buyers rejected and collectors now pay fortunes for, to fight a war against a Chrysler engine that it never quite definitively won. It was canceled after 2 years by forces it had no defense against, and it became immortal the moment it disappeared. That's not a car, that's a story. And honestly, it's one of the best ones Detroit ever told.